So Doc Holliday splits from Wyatt and heads up to Colorado with Dan Tipton. They lay over briefly in Trinidad. And in Pueblo. Holliday's kind of accosted by an interesting character in Pueblo that he's glad to get away from. He's gone to the theater in Pueblo, and a man comes up to him.
Well, let's add a couple of little details, and that is that they were basically they went to Trinidad because Bat Masterson was the
sheriff there.
Was the sheriff there, and what was it? The marshal.
He was a lawman.
He was a lawman. Okay. And there was a brief meeting again with Wyatt, and the rest of the crew showed up about that time. In fact, they didn't even get. This is how Doc was being very much, in some ways, bolder than the Earp party, because when the Earp party finally arrives, they get off the train before it comes into Trinidad and walked into the town. They didn't get off at the local.
And they take off as soon as they can for the Black Canyon country of the Gunnison. They're going to go into hiding for a while, lay low.
So they make it. They make the trip over to Pueblo, and Masterson is involved there too a little bit. He goes over, and there's a big plan to go to Denver to the horse races.
And that's Wyatt and Bat have this plan. It's not. I'm sorry, Doc and Bat. This isn't Wyatt's plan.
Yeah.
Wyatt and gang are going into hiding in the mountains.
And actually, just about all of them went to the others. Texas Jack Vermillion, Sherman McMaster, all of them at least went as far as Gunnison, and Dan Tipton with them. In fact,
but Doc feels comfortable in Colorado. He's been there before.
Yeah.
He feels like he's got friends in Colorado.
But he's also I believe he felt safe in the sense that he believed that that promises had been made that nothing would happen, and that's why I think it was that it was such a shock to him when he gets to Denver. He's got a plan when he gets to Denver. He's going to go talk to this mine owner from Leadville,
right,
who wants him to check out some mining property.
Vimont. Superintendent of the Little Pittsburgh mine in Leadville.
And so they get there, and he introduces himself to the town marshal, the chief of police. And
now this is in Pueblo. You're talking Pueblo.
No, I'm talking about
so
all along the way.
Okay.
When he gets to Denver, first thing he does is introduce himself to the sheriff and the chief of police. So he's not expecting trouble, but he's walking down the street going to see Vimont, and this man that he had run into originally in Pueblo had approached him one night. And he said all these crazy things to Doc, which made Doc dismiss him as some kind of a nut, and brushes him aside as being of no importance. And then, but he's on his way to a hotel, and this guy, whose name was Perry Mallon, stepped out of the shadows with a pistol he had borrowed from a policeman. It wasn't even his pistol. And said, "I've got you now. Throw up your hands, Doc Holliday."
And Perry Mallon claims to be a sheriff from California who's been chasing Holliday for years all over the country because Holliday killed his partner in California. He's chased him to the mining camps in California that Holliday ran with the big cattle rustling group out of California. He's got this crazy story that the police at first buy because the guy says he's a sheriff from California, and so two officers step out and arrest Holliday and put him in handcuffs. Haul him off to jail. And the first couple of news articles in the Denver papers basically follow the Mallon line. Dangerous sheriff killer. arrested on
what
streets.
A dangerous character Doc
Right.
Holliday is. But one of the papers started to interview him, and they came away with a totally different picture. And it was a picture about this gentlemanly fellow who that they had, and that didn't fit any of it. And they told the story. They let Doc tell most of the story, and that began to raise some questions.
And he said that he suspected that Mallon was a bounty hunter,
Yeah.
probably sent by Sheriff Bean back in Arizona to try
Yeah.
to collect him, make some money, bring him back.
But this is one of the reasons why I think that Wyatt, even though whatever the promises had been made by the authorities, Wyatt was skeptical. He was worried about some, because Wyatt was not as trusting as some other people, and I think that he was he was afraid that there would be some kind of attempt.
And when we say promises made, what we're saying is that Holliday's quite obvious connection to governmental people, and the fact that they'd been doing things that the government wanted to have happen, that they'd been given some promises that they would be protected.
And they'd been given money to do it.
Right, exactly.
But the thing is that's why I've always believed that if Perry Mallon hadn't shown up in Denver, that whole arrest would never have taken place.
And Doc Holliday never would have become as famous as he is, because it was
the
that
newspapers
Yes.
at that time said that he was described him as the leader of the notorious Earp gang.
right.
And at that particular moment in time, Doc Holliday became more famous than Wyatt Earp.
Which is, it's hard to believe, but it's absolutely true. Doc Holliday was the celebrity. Newspapers had all kinds of stories to tell about him, clear across the country, erroneous or not, but they were talking about him constantly. Wyatt Earp, they couldn't even spell his name right. Didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
So Doc Holliday was the celebrity.
But so then almost at once there seems to be a bevy of people who show up in Denver to act on his behalf.
Right.
The lawyer that he retained was not a junkyard lawyer.
Oh, one of the best in the
One
country.
of the best in Colorado.
Mhm.
He makes a good impression on the people that he talks to. It's a fascinating thing that happens, and then one by one these people emerge. A law officer from down around Pueblos comes and talks to him on his behalf. Now Wyatt said that he contacted Bat Masterson. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's quite possible that he did. I'm sure that Wyatt was the kind of man that would call in favors.
But the first problem is that how did Wyatt find out about this? Wyatt's hiding out in the Black Canyon country of the Gunnison, and it's as remote as you can get in Colorado. And
Well, they still had.
but he would have had to first hear about it from somebody, and then have passed messages back, during which time stuff is already happening on
Well, but
Holliday's
here's
behalf.
me.
But
I would
Bat
say
knew
that
about
somebody like Bat.
it. And why not Bat? Is it Bat who did it?
Bat picked up to me. He went to the telegraph office and sent a telegraph to Gunnison.
Try to find Wyatt. He's out there camping somewhere. Tell him what's going on.
But at any rate, then Bat goes up and intervenes, and then a whole series of other people, including two of his Georgia friends, Lee Smith, who was operating in Denver at the time and had a mining office there. He was in mining investments. He'd been following Doc around for years. He'd been in Las Vegas. He'd been at different points along the way. He knew Doc well from family connections, and he speaks on his behalf.
And again, that great lawyer he had, Colonel DeWeese, who was very famous.
DeWeese, and is providing legal services. And then there's Masterson himself pleads with the governor. And then one of the interesting things is that in Batman, Wyatt tells this story because he said that one of the people that he asked to help Doc was George W. Crummy. And so he tells that story about the Crummy arriving at the governor's office, and he was friends with the governor. And he tells them, they explain the situation, and Crummy says something like, do you know what it means to drive through a four in hand? And he said, and the governor said, yes. He said, well, drive on through this with a four in hand.
Holliday's case
Crummy is the final. Crummy was a very wealthy man. He had investments from Arizona all the way to Colorado. He was not only in mining, but he was also an investor in saloons.
Well, what's important about this arrest of Holliday is that it's not just being arrested. He's being threatened with extradition back to Arizona. That's what supposedly Arizona wants him back to put him on trial for the killing of Frank Stillwell in the Tucson train yard.
Here's the reason why. Here's the long and short of it. I think the people in Colorado, in Arizona, especially the Republican hierarchy and these business interests, mining, railroad, Wells Fargo, all those banking interests and so forth, all of those people did the last thing on earth they wanted was to have Doc Holliday or Wyatt Earp show back up in Arizona.
And start it all over again.
And it would be a political disaster for them to come back. For whatever the outcome was. But they were afraid that there would be attempts to ambush and kill them on the way back.
Well, and remember, the business interests of southern Arizona wanted it to seem very safe there. They wanted people to move in. They wanted businesses to come locate in. You got people out shooting each other all over the place.
Yeah, that's right. They say this time to end all this stuff.
So Doc is threatened with being extradited back, and a letter is sent from the governor of Arizona to the governor of Colorado with the extradition papers, and supposedly it's missing a signature. And so the governor of Colorado could have sent this letter back to ask for a signature and have it, fixed, a faulty paperwork. They just didn't get to it.
He didn't. No, he just denied the.
Yeah, he just let it sit on his desk.
And
so Holliday's free. He goes back down. Now he's got to go to Pueblo because in the meantime, one of Masterson's ploy is that he's come up to try to keep Doc in Arizona or in Colorado while this is going on. He's come up with a bogus charge against him in the Colorado courts. And so before Holliday, if he does get extradited, before he can be extradited out, he's first got to answer this Colorado charge. You've got to answer a charge here before you can go out of state. So they even made up a term for this, and it was called
holidaying.
Holidaying, a legal term, meaning that a bogus charge is brought up, so you have to answer that before you can answer another. But he's still got to go take care of this bogus charge. And is it Crummy who puts up the bond for him on that bogus charge?
Crummy and one other man, whose name I forget at the moment, but there were two of them that put up and I have no doubt that they didn't. They didn't expect that they would. But they realized that they would forfeit the bond.
Yeah, they weren't going to get the money back.
They weren't going to get the money back.
Because Holliday's case is just delayed and delayed and delayed forever. So he doesn't. So he's protected in Colorado. As long as he stays in Colorado, he's good and he's safe. And while he goes up to Leadville, he's down in Salida, Colorado. He's in some other spots. While he's maneuvering now around the mountains of Colorado, protected, he goes down to Pueblo for a case, or he appears in court in Pueblo, he goes back. He appears in court, this is how they keep delaying the case, he has to keep showing up in court. And so he does that, and while that's happening, Johnny Ringo dies in Arizona. And so one of the questions always I'm asked is, did Doc Holliday really kill Johnny Ringo?
And the answer is unequivocally no.
Absolutely. He was not available. He may have wanted to, but he wasn't. Question mark that Wyatt maybe had something to do with it, but I think that's probably very unlikely also.
The biggest problem is that Wyatt in a couple of places where he claims to have killed Ringo has it happen on the way out of Arizona.
Oops, that didn't happen.
And so it has it months before.
So he's got
The idea is that the idea that has been put forward is that Wyatt and Warren Earp and a couple of others left Gunnison and went by a back route back into Arizona and that's, in fact, there is a newspaper article in the Gunnison paper the day after Ringo was killed. It said that the Earps are still in the Gunnison.
Right.
It announced that they were still in Gunnison and were planning to be here for a while, and that they in the fall might go to California.
And Wyatt and Doc both may have had reasons to want to see the end of Ringo, but neither one of them killed him. So that's in answer to all those people who want to know. It wasn't Doc. So Doc kept making these visits back to Pueblo to show up in court and then go on his way again. He was in the town of Salida. They mentioned him being there. And interestingly, he got to go through the Royal Gorge. That Royal Gorge that had been under construction when he was working, for the Santa Fe Railroad. It was done, and it's a fabulous railroad ride through the Royal Gorge of the Colorado. So he got to see that because that was the route down to Pueblo. And so he was in Salida, which is at the other end of that. And then he went up to Leadville, and in Leadville is a mile high, or higher than a mile high. It's one of the highest cities in the country. Yeah. And they were competing at one time to be the new capital of Colorado because it was the huge silver mining camp of Colorado. All the money was going up there, and the railroads were building up there to bring that silver out. So Holliday went there. Weimont was there. He knew people there, and this was a place he could make money. But
Turkey Creek Jack Johnson and his brother were there.
Exactly.
Sherman McMaster was there for a time, and so there were
this is where his people
a number of people that Doc knew from his past that was there. But he made a decent impression on the sporting community, and might have been all right in Colorado if it had not been in Leadville if it hadn't been for another ghost.
Well, we're going to bring that ghost back in a second. Another thing that was great about Doc in Leadville that he was made one of the heads of the local independent political party.
Yeah, his independent political party served on the fire brigade.
Yes. Helped the fire at the Texas House in Leadville.
Yeah, and he was acknowledged for his.
Yes, he was. So people thought well of him there, but he got sick. It is cold and it is high, and they said that and I've been to Leadville several times, not in the depth of winter, but I've been there in the fall when it looked like winter. And Leadville, they say, has 3 seasons: early winter, late winter, and full winter, and that's about it. And this was a terrible place for a man with any kind of lung problem. He caught pneumonia twice. So he's now in a weakened state, and he has people who have now read about him because he's the famous Doc Holliday. He has men confronting him on the street all the time to prove their own grit against this famous Doc Holliday. And so he has a run-in with Bill Allen. You want to tell the Bill Allen story?
Well, another one of his friends, by the way, who was also involved in the effort to keep Doc from being sent back to Arizona, was a newspaper man named E.D. Cowan.
Yes.
Who moved to Leadville and was at Leadville during it, and
he was in Gunnison also at one time.
And thought very highly of Doc and his memoirs.
And may have written his obituary, actually.
Yeah. And he runs into the ghost that he runs into is Johnny Tyler.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay.
And who
one
is
of the Sloper crowd.
One of the Sloper crowd from Tombstone. And I think it's probably Tyler who poisons the mind of Billy Allen.
And Billy Allen was a police officer.
And he also worked in saloons.
And he was a former bouncer. And a weight trainer. And I didn't know they had weight trainers back then, but they did. So in other words, he's a big burly guy.
He's a big burly guy.
And Holliday's not.
Then this is a strange story to me because Doc Holliday was having his health was deteriorating in Leadville, and it's hard to. And as a result of that, he lost a couple of jobs because it was affecting his. It wasn't so much the coughing, or it was the manual dexterity, handling cards and so forth, became more difficult.
Right,
for
it's
him.
A sick man.
And he's a sick man, and so he gets down in the dumps, and he sells off a lot of some of his stuff, and then he goes, and he ends up borrowing $5 from
Bill Allen, police officer.
And what interests me about this is that it's $5 we're talking about, and they began to immediately, the Sloper crowd, including Johnny Tyler, they began to, press this thing and matter, and eventually Doc is, he's frightened. I mean, you don't want to say Doc Holliday is frightened, but I think he was.
But he went to the police. He went to the police officer there in Leadville, and he said, "I need you to back me up because these people are making threats against me over this $5."
Yeah, I'm being threatened, and I need your help.
I don't have this money to pay back yet. I will, and I need your help. And they said, "Well, if he shoots at you, let us know." And he said, "If he shoots at me, I'll be dead." So he figured he needed to defend himself. And the question, why didn't he just borrow it from somebody else to pay back? But he was having a struggle.
He tried. That's the thing about it, is that some of the people who paid his bond after he was arrested for shooting Billy Allen
paid more than the $5.
Right. If they'd have given him $5 up front, the whole incident would probably not have happened.
So it comes to a head. Holliday is living at this time above Manny Hyman's saloon. Manny Hyman was about Holliday's same age. He was a Jewish bartender, and he did a lot of charity work. And so he brought Holliday in, gave him a room up above, and Holliday was bartending for him in the saloon. And Holliday left his pistol behind the bar, and he told Manny, "They're coming for me, please let me know so I can defend myself." And one of his friends came upstairs that day and said, "Bill Allen's out there on the street and he's looking for you, and he's armed." So Holliday's very wary now.
Probably Lowmeister.
Yeah, yes. And so he comes downstairs, and he's behind the bar, and in comes Bill Allen with his pistol in his hand. And Holliday said he didn't wait for Bill Allen to shoot him because he knew he was going to. So he pulled out his gun and he fired 2 shots, and one went into the wall and one went into Bill Allen's arm. Now I have people ask me all the time, so was he a bad shot? How come he didn't just dead shoot him? I said, because he didn't want to go to prison. He's trying to disarm his enemy, and the best way you disarm someone is to hit him in the shooting arm. Well, he disarmed him all right, because Bill Allen struggled for a long time with that arm. But then he's arrested.
And we go through another trial. This is a trial, not just a hearing. Right. This is a formal trial.
In the courthouse there in Leadville, and it's a real trial. And Holliday has court-appointed defenders who are busy with other cases, and he's afraid they're not going to do a good defense. So he asked them, can he go serve his own warrants? He wants to serve warrants on everybody, or summonses. He wants to serve summonses on all the men who've been in all the saloons where this guy's made threats all through this year. And so they make him an official appointee of the court. So Doc Holliday's the defendant. He's also the court official collecting his own summonses from this long list of gamblers in all the saloons, and they all come in to defend Doc Holliday's character. So it's almost funny, except that it was a life and death situation for him again, because if he'd had to go to jail again with that and he's already sick, might not have turned out well.
Doc was also realized that he was weak and he did not have the same dexterity either with cards or guns that he had had
Right.
when a couple of years earlier, because and the newspapers are talking about his health all the time.
Right, they are.
Whereas in other places, nobody seems to ever mention the fact that he was
Exactly,
a
they
consumptive.
never mentioned it before. And interestingly, this court case, if you read this court case, it reads just like the hearing in the OK Corral, where really the question is, are you allowed to defend yourself when someone has made a threat of an endless series of threats against you? And that was the same thing here, and the court decided he was allowed to defend himself against this man, and he got off. And it's at that point that now he's broke. He's been on trial, and he's had a long estrangement from his family back home. And it's at that point that we think that he made a trip to
New Orleans.
New Orleans. And actually, there's a mention of it in one of the newspapers in Leadville. So, I think he went down to New Orleans, and who did he meet in New Orleans?
Well, they were having actually there were two meetings about a week apart. The first one was the meeting of Mexican war veterans.
And that would be his father.
That would be his
Henry
father,
Holliday.
who was brought to New Orleans by a young man named Zan Griffith.
Who was just a teenager at the time, so he kind of went along with Henry Holliday, Major Henry Holliday, kind of as a valet. And Major's older by now. He's in his 60s. So
Major's, he's getting up there.
Yeah. And so he goes along to help with Major.
Then a week or so later, there was a dental association meeting, and Robert Holliday, his cousin, Hub, comes out for that.
And attends that, so he may have had a chance to meet both the men in his family at that time. And
Major tried to persuade Doc to go home with him. He said, this has gone on long enough. Come home so we can take care of you. But he refused. And decided to go back he went back briefly to Leadville, but he did not stay there long. And he sort of disappears off the scene.
All we know for a bit is that he's wandering until just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Tell your discovery of that.
Well, there was an article in I think it was either in a St. Louis paper or an Omaha paper, but anyway, in fact, it may have been in both, like some of those articles were in those. By this time, people are beginning to talk about the Wild West characters. They're beginning to. There's more writing about the people see the Old West dying, and they're being nostalgic about it, and they're asking about what people are doing.
Well, it's because the railroads have finally connected the whole country almost. It's really the end of the stagecoach era. It's the beginning of the modern era.
So I haven't nailed down all of the details about how he got there, but and what exact route he took. Probably one of the easiest routes would have been to go from up to Cheyenne and across that way.
There were a couple of trains that went up. You could go Cheyenne and take stage.
Or he could have gone out of. He could have gone west.
There was a train that went to Salt Lake City.
And
then went all the way up to Butte.
Went all up to Butte, Montana.
Yeah, never had to get off a train.
There's not a word about Butte, Montana in this book.
Or in my books. In our 4 books, there's not a word of Butte, Montana.
But the story came. There was an interview with Bat Masterson, and said, "Where's Doc Holliday?" And he said, "Well, he spent last winter up in the Butte, but he's in bad health. He said had pneumonia, and he's been suffering quite a bit.
He's got a cold. I'm afraid it's going to do him up."
I'm afraid it's going to do him up. And so he. And I had not
We hadn't even looked there. We hadn't even imagined
I hadn't
Montana.
even imagined that anything about Butte. But he showed up in Butte in 1885, I think.
1885.
And he, in the summer.
And welcome to town like he was a celebrity. The newspapers mentioned the famous Doc Holliday is here. Here's where he's staying in a nice hotel in town.
Staying in one of the best hotels in town.
Which makes us wonder when he goes from being broke in Leadville to New Orleans to see his father, and now he's staying in a nice hotel when he goes back.
Yeah, well.
His dad probably gave him some funds.
Yeah, or that could have been some gambling money involved. But he stayed in Butte from the summer into February of '86.
Through a really horrible winter.
Through
really
a
bad
terrible winter.
Yeah.
And Butte is another place that's somebody with respiratory problems doesn't need to hang out.
And people may wonder what Butte was. Butte was not just a silver mining capital, it was also the copper capital. This is where William Randolph Hearst, who built the Hearst Castle, or his son built the Hearst Castle.
Hearst.
Yeah, George Hearst, sorry. George Hearst, his son was William Randolph, who built the Hearst Castle. This is where George Hearst, it's one of the mining camps where he made his fortune investing in the copper mine.
The Anaconda mine.
Yes, exactly. And it's beautiful. Butte is a beautiful bowl way high in the mountains. It has a view forever, but it has, I was there in July and I thought it was winter. So
well,
it's tough.
But at one time it was, Butte was a pit. Those open mines had turned Butte into it was.
Well, and that was after his time. It wasn't the open pit mining yet, but that definitely has devastated part of the countryside.
But he seems to have stayed pretty much out of trouble while he was in Butte. One of the things that may have helped him was that the local marshal in Butte was a man by the name of his last name was Meiklejohn.
Yes.
Which is easier to remember than his first name right off. But
Officer Meiklejohn, it's fine.
But interestingly enough, Meiklejohn had served on the police force. He was a very, very colorful character too. Somebody needs to write about him. Meiklejohn he had been a drummer boy in the Civil War, and he later was on hand when the Henry Plummer and the vigilantes got and they went after Henry Plummer gang and they hanged all these people in Montana.
So he's a tough guy.
Meiklejohn was staying with one of the men who was hanged because he was just still a little boy, basically. But Meiklejohn was a peace officer in at least one, possibly two towns in Montana where Morgan Earp was also an officer. So there was
some connection there. And so Holliday has a run-in in a saloon in Butte. It's the same story it's been in other places where people want to take on this now frail but legendary, by this time, Doc Holliday, and he gets, he makes threats against the person. And is he arrested for threats? They're coming after him.
Well, there are stories that he and Meiklejohn had a confrontation early on, in which they introduced himself, and he told him that, to be careful while he was in, warned him to be. The incident that caused him trouble took place in a restaurant, and there were only 3 people in the room at the time. It was late at night or something. And one of them was either the owner or the cook or somebody like that. And there's a third person that Doc, who was drinking, began to insult and make threats to you. And he was waving his pistol around. And eventually this was broken up, but what happened next was, it turned out that the man that he was bullying in this place was a prominent member of the community. So he picked on the wrong guy, basically.
Unless the wrong guy was already picking on him, which is very true of most of these last years of his life.
But there's not much in the papers about whether it was a confrontation, but it seems, and Doc was, well, first of all, a day or two went by, and the grand jury indicted Doc
for making threats.
For making threats with a pistol.
And so they're going to come after him and find him.
And they're going to come after him, and Doc says...
Or don't they find him in bed?
They sent they sent a deputy sheriff to arrest him, and the deputy sheriff finds him in bed, sick, and the doctor tells the deputy he's too sick to be moved.
You'll have to wait.
You'll have to wait.
Yeah.
He's not going anywhere.
But he did.
But he did. The next day, he caught a train east.
Well, the newspaper said the train east. He may have told people he was going east, but what he did was he went back to Colorado, back where he was safe. And we don't know what route
he went. One route, but he could have gone, if he had gone east, they said to the St. Paul, but he could have gone, there was a way for him to get to Cheyenne and drop down from Cheyenne to Leadville pretty quickly.
So he ends up back in Colorado again, safe and sound. So and there's one interesting side story to that Montana thing. We're not going to spend hardly any time on it, but there's also a possibility that while he was there, he disappears from time to time because there's letters sent for him and he's not there to collect a letter. So there's a couple of times when he's missing from Butte, and he may very well have gone over to Hunter's Hot Springs, which was a very short ride on the train to a famous hot springs resort for consumptives and for lots of other people. And it's at Hunter's Hot Springs that the Montana Stockmen's Association, Stock Growers Association, the Cattlemen's Association, they're meeting at Hunter's Hot Springs to try to figure out what to do about their rustler problem. And in that group of men who came to that meeting at Hunter's Hot Springs was Theodore Roosevelt, he was actually ranching in North Dakota, but he had joined the Montana Stock Growers Association, and his neighbor, the Marquis de Moray, who was this French nobleman. And there's a famous picture that's come out of Hunter's Hot Springs, which looks very much like Teddy Roosevelt and the Marquis de Moray. So there's we don't know for sure about that picture, but the fact is Holliday was in Montana at the very same time all of that was happening, and he may have had a meeting with a not yet President of the United States. Interesting. One of the possibilities. But anyway, he ends up back in Colorado, and we think he had one final meeting with Wyatt Earp when he went back.
Well, he eventually went to Denver and was staying in Denver, and Wyatt was visiting Denver, and they met in the hotel where Wyatt was staying. Wyatt said he looked up and saw Doc walking toward him, and they confronted each other and sat down and talked for a while, and finally Doc said, "Goodbye, old friend," and they parted ways. And that's interesting to me because not only because of its last meeting, and there's this kind of emotional
poignant meeting.
That's a good thing to have happened for them to have come to, because Wyatt had not paid much attention to Doc through the years. He was in Aspen for a while, for an extended period, and there's no indication that he ever attempted to see Doc while he was in the...
And Aspen's in between Leadville and Glenwood Springs, where he's going to end up. So let's go to Glenwood Springs. So Doc Holliday ends up in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and it was tough to get there at the time. The train had not yet arrived. And so he would have had to get there through Leadville and then going over Independence Pass by stagecoach, which is a harrowing, I've driven in a car, it's harrowing now, it was way more harrowing then, going by stagecoach down through Aspen, where Wyatt had been, down into Glenwood Springs. Why go to Glenwood Springs? For the vapor caves. Now it's a hot springs resort, and you can go swim in the very nice, wonderful hot swimming pools they have there. But at the time, it was the vapor caves, and these were the Yampa Vapor Caves discovered by the Ute Indians. This had been a sacred place for the Utes, and they had one cave that they used as a sweat house for people who were sick. And they would lower you down into that cave and wait until you sweated out the illness. And then as the white settlers came in, they opened up 2 more caves along the same part of the river there. And so there were, they called them a palace in hell, because you went down into this hot, sulfury, yellow, vapory place, and you can only stay there about 10 minutes at a time. And you'd go down, and Doc would have gone down the stone-cut steps into the vapor caves, take off all your clothes, wrap a sheet around you, and sit there and sweat 10 minutes, and then you're out of there. And this should have healed him if he hadn't been ill enough. Some people were healed by these the sulfur vapors. You know, we have sulfa drugs. There are some people that were healed from this, but he was evidently too far along already. While he was there in Glenwood Springs, he tried to support himself, the locals say, by doing dentistry. Perry Mallaby, not Perry Mallon, the bounty hunter, but a man named Perry Mallaby was on the police force there, and he talked about Doc Holliday, and Mrs. Mallaby went to go see Doc to have some dental work done. There were no dentists in Glenwood Springs. The closest one was up in Aspen, another long stagecoach ride into the mountains. And so it would have been very nice to have him there doing a little bit of dentistry. But she said she went to see him, and he coughed so hard it sounded like he was going to cough his life away. And he asked her to come back another time. So there were people in the town who felt for him and admired him. Perry Mallaby said that when Doc passed away, he was one of the ones who passed around the hat to raise money. He went there. He may have tended bar a little bit. One thing that we believe that he did do was sit on an ore site for a mine that was there. There was contention over this particular mine, and 2 sides fighting over it had hired guards. Judd Riley told this story. He was a policeman from Gunnison and also Glenwood Springs, and he talked about how he got Doc the job to sit on this mining concern. It was $10 a day, and you didn't have to do anything but sit there with a gun. So he had some money. He may have spent his whole time there at the Hotel Glenwood, but that's very expensive. Art Kendrick, who was a busboy, and said that he used to take Doc his whiskey in the morning. Art Kendrick's family actually owned the Kendrick Hotel, which was less expensive hotel. So he may have stopped at the Kendrick and then moved to the Hotel Glenwood as he got more ill, because they had a nurse and a doctor on staff. So there was no sanitarium like they show in the movies. He was staying in a hotel, but it was a fabulous hotel. It had electric lights, because Glenwood Springs, they had a river coming through and they had power, one of the first electric lit cities in Colorado. They had an elevator in this hotel and a doctor on staff, and while he was there, the railroad first came to Glenwood Springs, finishing the days of the Wild West in Colorado, and that's while Doc was there. And they said that in his last 2 weeks, he had pneumonia, they said was his last illness. In his last 2 weeks, he didn't speak at all. So he didn't wake up and say, "Give me a whiskey." He didn't say, "There's my feet, well, I'll be damned." He didn't say any of that. He was silent, which is what happens when you're dying of consumption. You can't breathe. Do you have any comments on those last days? Because I want to talk about his burial.
Well, I think that there's some new things that have been found recently by some other researchers that shows that Doc moved around a little bit more than I had thought he had after he came back to Colorado.
Mm-hmm. Silverton, maybe.
And there are all those questions about the possibilities of side trips or things that we haven't run into yet that might have taken place. But I know that he was in. There were letters that were waiting for him in Aspen, mm-hmm. and there may have been at least 2 occasions where he worked defending property.
Well, and that was a good job for him. That was an easy job to do.
And so he moved into different places. We didn't mention, because this happened several years earlier, we didn't mention the fact that despite the fact that a lot of people say he wasn't there, that there's the writings.
Oh, the Dodge City Gang.
The writings of newspapers and so forth of that year make it, there was a swarm of information saying that Doc Holliday was present with in the Dodge City War when Wyatt Earp and others went back to Dodge City to help Luke Short.
And this is at the time that he would have been in Leadville, so he could have hopped the train and gone down.
Well, at the time when all that took place, Masterson was in Silverton, and that's where. And a group of them met in Silverton.
And there's a newspaper story out of Silverton, well, at least from the New York papers with the dateline Silverton with Doc. So in other words, there are so many things still, so many places that we haven't covered. This isn't a whole book, unfortunately, or a trilogy like mine, but there's more to know.
There's probably a story that you've probably read that this guy that had worked as a late night employee from one of the Denver papers. Told the story that in 1883 he was working late and these three men came in and he said he just kind of dismissed them at first, and they said they had a story that they needed to get out, and he talked to them and he was unimpressed until he asked them their names, and the spokesman for the three said, "My name is Bat Masterson, and this is Shotgun Collins and Doc Holliday." And he said, "Well, that got my attention, and I wrote a story that went out on the next day on the lines." But that's kind of an interesting, and that would have been when Masterson was leaving Silverton going east. And
so that all would have connected. There are so many possibilities still to find out. There's papers that are still buried, things we're still learning. You're going to have a second and third edition of your book. I can't redo my novels, but I did write a book about his railroad travels, so I have a lot of those stories in there. Here. This one, The World of Doc Holliday, History and Historic Images. This one is inspired by his travels on the trains and all around the country with some of the new information that we had there. But I want to take us back here, back to Glenwood Springs. He's passing away in the Hotel Glenwood. And, the story that Wyatt was his only friend, that's not what the people in Glenwood Springs said. The paper said that he had a long line of friends who followed him to his last resting place. The Linwood Cemetery had been donated the year before by Jacob Schwartz, who was the local undertaker. He owned the property, and he donated the land for the Linwood Cemetery up there. People were buried up in that cemetery the day before Doc's death, the day after his death, so clearly it was being used. And Jacob Schwartz had his undertaker shop at the back of a furniture store right across the street from the Hotel Glenwood. So at least we know who funeralized Doc. Yes.
And in the same on the day before Doc died, the Leadville papers reported that that the people of Leadville had collected a large sum of money to be sent to Doc Holliday.
Is that right? See,
yes.
He had, so they knew he was in his last days.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's touching, because he really did have friends. His cousin Maddie said of him that he was a much different man than the one of Western legend, and she actually stayed in communication with him his whole life. When he passed away, the newspaper said he had one correspondent in his family, and that was his cousin, a nun who lived in Atlanta. She'd become a nun not too many years before. She didn't enter a nunnery over a scandalous affair with her cousin, but becoming a nun was something that a Catholic girl would have looked forward to doing.
Well, that was, and we did not talk about the story.
So many things we didn't talk about.
About Maddie and Doc, and I've always considered the possibility that it might have been a combination of things that sent him. One thing might not have sent him west, but the piling up of different.
I think so, because in our own lives, it's generally a piling up of things that causes these changes in our lives, and that he had this, affection for his cousin that couldn't be rewarded because she was Catholic and he wasn't, and Catholics couldn't marry their cousins.
Yeah.
So, but according to an old family story out of Griffin, Georgia, his home, he came home, and that may have been a story Maddie may have known too. Glenwood Springs is very upfront about the fact that they don't know where he went to. And it may have been because he was buried in a pauper's grave at the back of the cemetery, and it just wasn't marked. But they don't know. They have a lovely marked area there for him, but it's somebody else's grave, because he did die there. But there was an old, so Glenwood Springs lost him. They don't know where he went to. And a story that came out of Griffin, Georgia, around the turn of the last century, was that his father, when he heard he'd passed away, he had him brought home to Georgia, which wasn't an unusual thing to do. People were disinterred and moved. The railroads didn't have any hygiene requirements for it. There were no Colorado laws yet about removing remains, so it's possible, and that you didn't have to record it anywhere either. It was just more freight. So we may never be able to track the story down. But based on that story, the city of Griffin, his hometown, based on these old stories that his father had brought him back and had him reburied in a grave there in Griffin, they were preparing to put a big plaque in the Griffin City Cemetery. And that story was in the newspapers. And the city commissioner who was in charge of that project got a phone call from a local lawyer. And he said, I hear you're going to put a gravestone marker or a marker to Doc Holliday in my family's plot. And the city commissioner said, darn, we thought we had Doc Holliday there. And he said, you do. He said, my ancestor was good friends of his growing up when they were boys in Griffin. And when he passed away, his father contacted the family and asked if he could have some space in our family plot to bring his boy back home. That story has been in our family for 100 years. And the city commissioner said, how come you haven't ever said anything about it? And he said, nobody ever asked us. So I think for Doc, who made his life gambling and betting on things, I think he would like the fact that there's a good bet he can be in two different graves. Both there and back here. And I think that he would be so honored that you devoted the years of your life that went into writing your mark. Can we hold up the copy of it? Yeah. Okay. I have this in 3 forms, all marked up. This amazing book, and I call it the seminal biography because there is nothing higher than this. Not unless you write another one. Will there be? Because anything else that will ever be written on his life, they're going to have to consult you. I did, and I had the blessing of consulting you personally. Mm-hmm. And then marking the heck out of your book, too, when I had questions. But you will always remain the seminal biographer of Doc Holliday. I'm getting choked up.
I just say it's a pretty good first draft.
It was a darn good first draft. Do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to leave our reader? We could do another, 5 hours.
Yeah, we could.
We got more to say.
There are so many things that, so many questions that I still have, and so much research. I've become fascinated by the people like Lee Smith. We were talking about the people that he corresponded with. We know it was Maddie. There's some indication that he corresponded with the Roberts family, Robert Holliday's family. There are people like you don't know who else. There are multiple people who, but it's pretty clear that at least he and Lee Smith stayed in touch with each other, and I'm fascinated by Lee Smith, who was really a colorful character, and could use at least an article to talk about him and how his
get it written
and his impact. I want to do an article on the unbelievably haunting notion that Doc killed Ringo, but I've got some interesting information in the last year or so that it was changed. I mean, it's clarified in my mind what happened there. I'm still not convinced about Griffin, but I'm willing to learn, because I mean, this person who stopped the effort. I wonder if does he have any kind of thing other than it's a family story?
Don't know. There's another thing to explore.
Yeah, but it's so there's some unanswered questions, and there's still some holes in the chronology. There's still some places I want to know what he did after he left. If he went straight back to Colorado from Butte, or if he took a roundabout route somewhere else. I don't know. I'm the Pella portrait is
we didn't
an
even go
interesting
there.
one.
Yep.
And that there's a question. There are so many Doc Holliday photographs that are supposed to be him.
Every man with a mustache.
If he's got a mustache,
He's a Doc Holliday.
There's even a photograph of a woman and a man, with the man carrying a sawed-off shotgun. It's been found.
Well, it must be Doc.
So that's got to be Doc Holliday. And a guy found a nice photograph in an abandoned car. It's an old antique photograph that shows Doc, or shows a dentist wearing a derby with dental tools in his hand, and the man sitting in a dental chair.
Yep. Does he have a mustache? It's probably Doc.
Oh yeah, he has a mustache, but it's and he's certainly got the skinny look that that you would expect from Doc Holliday in that picture. So it's.
So in other words, like all good writings, you end up with more questions.
That's right. That's the way. And some of the rewrites that I would do today, if I were working on this book, would not be based on new material, but the consideration of other people's work, like yours, and like Bosenecker's, and like
Peter Brand.
Who is just absolutely amazing at what he's been able to find. He helped immensely in filling in some of the blanks about Perry Mallon in Denver, and his book on Johnny Tyler, I think, is really well done, and he just continues to put out stuff that's top drawer.
Well, and again, without you to start it all, the rest of us wouldn't be working. So thank you for this long conversation we've had today. It's been really fun to be back talking with you again.
It's always a pleasure.
Give people a glimpse of what it's been like for us for all these many years. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you. It's great to see you, always. You're the one.
Oh, gosh.